Someone hands you a book. You open it at page 1 and start reading it straight through, the way you would read any book anyone has ever handed you. And it opens beautifully. A garden. A flood. An old man walking out of his city toward a country that nobody has drawn on a map yet. Then, somewhere around page 90, you arrive at a chapter about mildew spreading across the plaster of a wall and what a priest is supposed to do about it. That is where most people quietly stop, not because the book turned bad, because nobody ever told them what it was they were actually holding. It is not a book. It never was a book. It is a shelf. Law codes, palace records, love poetry, war songs, letters posted to real cities, signed off with the names of real people who owed somebody money, written across roughly 15 centuries, by dozens of hands, in 3 languages, by people who mostly never met each other and never knew they were making one object. And here is the part almost nobody gets told at the start. They are not shelved in the order they were written. So this is every book of the Bible. All 66 of them, in the order you will actually find them, front cover to back. One clear line for each. What it is doing there, and the single detail that makes it that book and not the one sitting next to it. And underneath all of it, a shape. So the order stops feeling random and starts telling you where in the shelf you are standing. Because that is the whole trick, and it takes about a minute to learn. The books are grouped by kind. The First Testament runs law, then history, then poetry, then the long prophets, then the short ones. 5 sections, in that order, every time. The Second Testament is built the same way, story first, then a stack of letters, then a single vision, alone, at the end. Which means this shelf is arranged the way a library is arranged, by type. Not the way a diary is arranged, by date. Genesis is ancient. But Job may well be older still, and Job sits far down the shelf, filed with the poetry, because that is what Job is. Once you can see the grouping, the mildew chapter stops being a wall you hit and becomes a section you are simply walking through. So, section by section, book by book, nothing skipped. We start where the shelf starts. The first section is the law. In Hebrew, the Torah, which is closer to instruction than to legislation. 5 books, and they move as one long story. A world is made. A family is chosen. That family becomes a nation in chains. The nation is brought out, and it is taught how to live near a holy God. Genesis. In Hebrew, it is simply called by its first word, in the beginning. It is the book of origins, and it starts wider than anything after it. Sky, sea, land, animals, humanity, all of it, before a single Israelite exists. Then it narrows, hard, onto one family and stays there. And notice how it ends. Not on a mountaintop. The last sentence of Genesis is a man's embalmed body lying in a coffin in Egypt. Exodus. The name is Greek and it means the way out. A nation is born in a single night and walks into a desert with nothing. And then the surprise. The plagues take a handful of chapters. The instructions for building one portable tent for God take more than twice as many. Leviticus, the mildew book. It is the one nobody finishes, and it is not a story at all. It is a working manual handed to priests. Its own word for what it is doing is holy, not moral. Holy, meaning set apart, kept distinct, not mixed. Everything in it is about keeping categories from bleeding. Numbers. The English title comes from 2 head counts, one taken as the journey begins and one taken a whole generation later, after everything has gone wrong. The Hebrew name is better, in the wilderness. That is the real subject. A people who could have arrived in weeks and instead spent 40 years not arriving. Deuteronomy. Another Greek label, meaning the second law. It is not a new law. It is Moses, on the last day of his life, repeating the old one. He is speaking on the wrong side of the river to a generation that was not there the first time. Then he climbs a mountain, dies, and no one is ever shown the grave. Second section. History. 12 books that run from the crossing of the Jordan to a broken city and a slow, partial return from exile. Watch what these books are actually interested in. Not conquest. They are interested in leadership and in what a nation does when the leadership fails. Joshua. The land is entered and then, at unbelievable length, divided. Whole chapters are property boundaries, tribe by tribe, ridge by ridge, well by well. Judges. The bleakest book in the section, and it runs on a loop. The people go wrong. An enemy presses in. They cry out. A rescuer rises. The land rests. Repeat. Each rescuer is stranger than the last, and the book's own final line is the diagnosis. There was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Ruth. 4 short chapters dropped into that darkness. A foreign widow from Moab refuses to go home, gleans in somebody's field, and marries into Israel. And the book closes by quietly running her family line forward until it reaches a name the next books cannot stop saying. David. 1 Samuel. The people demand a king so they can be like everyone else. The prophet warns them exactly what a king will cost, and they take him anyway. They get Saul, who is tall and impressive and hollow, and then a shepherd boy is anointed behind his back while Saul is still on the throne. 2 Samuel. David reigns, and the book refuses to flatter him. His worst night is written down in the same steady voice as his best. And at the center sits a promise about his house lasting, which every later book in this shelf will keep reaching back to touch. 1 Kings. Solomon builds the temple, and then the kingdom he inherited splits in half over a burden his son will not lighten and never reassembles. 2 Kings. 2 capitals, 2 long declines, 2 collapses. The northern one falls to Assyria, and generations later the southern one falls to Babylon. 1 Chronicles. It begins with 9 chapters that are almost nothing but names, and it begins that list with Adam. It is a nation rebuilding its own memory. 2 Chronicles. The same monarchy, retold from inside the temple. It ends mid-sentence on a Persian king's permission slip and the words "let him go up." Ezra. They go up. A ruined altar is rebuilt on its old footprint, and the foundation of a smaller temple is laid while the old men weep. Nehemiah. A cupbearer to the Persian king asks for leave, comes home, and rebuilds the city wall in 52 days with the builders holding weapons. Esther. The last book of this section, set in Persia, and famous for what is missing. God is never named in it, not once. The rescue looks entirely like coincidence. Third section. Poetry and wisdom. 5 books, and the change is immediate. The narration stops. Nobody is telling you what happened anymore. These books are the inner life of the same nation. What it sang, what it argued about, what it could not resolve and wrote down anyway. Job. Framed in prose, but the vast middle is poetry, and it is an argument. A blameless man loses everything and demands a reason. 3 friends supply answers, and the answers are wrong. Then God speaks out of a storm and never once explains. He asks questions instead for 4 solid chapters. Psalms. 150 poems, gathered into 5 collections, each collection closing with a burst of praise where the seam was stitched. And they are not all serene. There are songs here that accuse God of sleeping, and one that ends in the dark with no resolution at all. Proverbs. Short, hard, portable sayings, and the thing to know is what they are not. They are not promises. They are observations about how life usually runs. Ecclesiastes. The strangest book on the shelf. A teacher tries pleasure, work, wealth, and wisdom, and reports back that all of it is hevel. usually translated meaningless, but the word means vapor. Breath on a cold morning. Real, visible, and gone before you can close your hand on it. Song of songs. Love poetry, unembarrassed, two voices praising each other's bodies in garden imagery from beginning to end. The tradition has read it as a picture of God and his people for a very long time, and it is worth saying plainly that the poem itself never says so. Fourth section. The prophets, and first the long ones. Not fortune tellers. Prosecutors, mostly, sent to a nation that has broken an agreement. Their pattern almost never changes. Here is what you promised. Here is what you did. Here is what is coming. And here, at the end, is what will be left. Isaiah. It has as many chapters as the whole Bible has books, which is a coincidence people make a great deal of, and the text makes nothing of. Its front half is a courtroom over Assyria. Its back half speaks to people already in exile, and out of it walks a servant who suffers on somebody else's behalf. Jeremiah. By word count in Hebrew, the longest book on the shelf and the most miserable job in it. He preaches for 40 years and nobody listens. He is thrown into a cistern, sinks in the mud, and is pulled out with rags under his arms so the ropes do not tear him. Then he goes back to preaching. Lamentations. 5 short poems written over the ruins of Jerusalem, and their form is the astonishing part. Grief, this raw, built into a strict pattern. 4 of them march straight through the Hebrew alphabet, a letter at a time, from the first letter to the very last one. Sorrow from A to Z, deliberately. Ezekiel. A priest deported to Babylon, sitting by an irrigation canal, who looks up and sees 4 living creatures, each with 4 faces and 4 wings. And it ends with 9 chapters of a temple that does not exist, measured out gate by a man with a bronze face and a measuring reed. Daniel. Half of it is court stories, half of it is visions, and the language itself changes underneath you. It starts in Hebrew, switches to Aramaic, and switches back, which tells you something about the audience. Part of this book is written in the everyday international language of the empire it is set inside. Fifth section, the short prophets. 12 of them, and in the Hebrew scriptures they are 1 scroll, not a dozen, because separately they are small enough to lose. They are not sorted by size. The order runs loosely by date, with the last 3 standing after the exile, and the Greek Old Testament shuffles the opening 6 differently again. So take them one at a time. Each has one thing that no other book on the shelf does. Hosea is told to marry a woman who will be unfaithful, and then to name their children the sermon, "No mercy, not my people." His family is the message. Joel watches a locust swarm strip the country bare and reads it as a warning, then promises a day when God pours out his Spirit on everybody, sons and daughters alike. Amos is not a professional. He says so himself. A herdsman and a tender of sycamore figs sent north to tell a wealthy nation that God despises its worship. Obadiah is the shortest book in the Old Testament, a single chapter, and it is aimed at one neighboring people who stood and watched Jerusalem burn. Micah asks the question that outlives the whole section. What does God require of you? To do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. Jonah is the odd one out, and everyone knows it. It is the only book here that is a story about the prophet rather than a collection of his preaching. He runs from the assignment, gets swallowed, preaches one flat sentence of warning, watches it work, and sulks. The book ends on a question, unanswered, aimed at him. Nahum is the sequel nobody expects. The same city Jonah was sent to save generations later, and this time the book announces flatly that it is coming down. Habakkuk does something none of the others do. He does not preach at people. He argues with God out loud and writes the argument down without smoothing it. Zephaniah is the sound of the day of the Lord, sweeping the whole earth clean, and then, in its last lines, God himself singing over the survivors. Haggai is dated to the day, and its complaint is domestic. You live in paneled houses, he says, while the house of God lies in ruins. The work restarts. Zechariah stacks 8 visions into a single night. A man on a red horse among myrtle trees, a flying scroll, chariots coming out from between 2 bronze mountains. Malachi closes the section as an argument in question and answer, and the last word of the English Old Testament is a threatened curse. Then the shelf goes quiet. Roughly 4 centuries pass here, with no book in this collection to cover them. Empires change hands. The world the next section opens in is a Roman one. And this gap is exactly where you have probably heard the rumor that some council somewhere voted and books were thrown out of the Bible. Here is what actually happened, and it is calmer than the rumor. For the first few centuries, there was no single sealed Bible for anyone to throw anything out of. There were lists. Churches circulated them, compared them, and mostly agreed. 2 North African councils at the end of the 4th century published one such list. It included books like Tobit, Judith, and Maccabees. At the same time, Jerome, translating the whole thing into Latin, drew a line those councils had not drawn. Books in the Hebrew scriptures on one side, on the other, books the church could read for edification but should not use to settle doctrine. The reformers took Jerome's line. Luther printed those books in his Bible, between the Testaments, under a heading calling them useful and good to read, but not equal to Scripture. The Council of Trent answered in 1546 by defining the Catholic list, which is why a Catholic Bible carries 73 books rather than 66. Orthodox churches keep a wider set again, and the Ethiopian church keeps the widest of all. Nobody burned anything. The line was simply drawn in different places, and ours sits where the Jewish scriptures sit. Same text counted differently. 24 scrolls there rather than 39 books here, because Samuel is 1 scroll and not 2. The order differs too. In the standard Jewish arrangement, the last thing you read is not a curse. It is Chronicles, and Chronicles ends with the door held open. Now the Second Testament. 4 accounts of one life, then the story of what happened next, then the letters, then the vision. Matthew opens the whole thing with a genealogy, which is a deliberate choice. He is writing for readers who need the family tree before they will hear anything else. His refrain is that this fulfills what was written, and he gathers the teaching into 5 great blocks, the first of which is the Sermon on the Mount. Mark is the shortest and the fastest. Almost no build-up, no birth, no genealogy. A voice in the desert, and then everything happening immediately, over and over. And our oldest complete manuscripts stop it dead at the empty tomb, with the women running away frightened and saying nothing to anyone. The familiar longer ending comes later. Luke is the longest of the 4, and the only one that explains its own method. He has investigated, he says, and he is writing an orderly account for a man named Theophilus. John is the outlier. No parables in the usual sense, no exorcisms, and long conversations instead. It hangs on a set of signs and a set of I am sayings, and it tells you flatly why it exists. These are written so that you may believe. It is the only one that states its purpose in a sentence. Acts is volume 2 of Luke, addressed to the same man, and it is the hinge of the whole shelf. A local movement becomes an empire-wide one, and it does not end. It stops. Paul is under house arrest in Rome, renting his own lodging, still preaching, and nobody stops him. That is the last sentence. Then the letters, and the first thing to know is that they are not in the order they were written either. Paul's 13 are stacked by size. The ones addressed to churches come first, then the ones to individuals, each group running longest to shortest. So the first letter you meet is not the first he sent. It is a filing decision. Romans. The longest, and unusually, it is written to a church he has never visited. He is introducing himself because he wants their backing for a trip to Spain. So he lays the whole argument out from the ground up. His own word for the center of it is righteousness. The slogans the Reformation built on it came 15 centuries later. 1 Corinthians is not a treatise. It is an answering letter to a congregation that is fighting, and you can hear their questions in his phrase, now concerning. 2 Corinthians is the most wounded thing he wrote. His authority is under attack, so he defends it by listing his beatings and boasts about being weak. Galatians is the angriest. Every other letter he sends to a church opens with thanks. This one opens with, I am astonished, and goes straight for the throat. Ephesians has a puzzle in the first verse. In our oldest manuscripts, the words in Ephesus are not there, which suggests a blank left for whichever city read it next. Philippians is a thank you note from prison, and the most cheerful thing in the collection. Joy keeps surfacing in it from a man who is writing under guard. Colossians is aimed at a rival teaching he simply calls philosophy and empty deceit, and he answers it not with rules, but with a hymn about Christ holding everything together. 1 Thessalonians is probably the earliest surviving letter he wrote, which makes it the oldest page in the Second Testament, and it answers a grief question about the dead. 2 Thessalonians is a correction, and it ends with something oddly human. He takes the pen from his secretary to sign it himself because forged letters are circulating. 1 Timothy and Titus are working instructions to two men left in charge of young churches, one in Ephesus and one on the island of Crete. 2 Timothy is the last letter, and the last request in it is not theological. Bring the cloak I left at Troas, he writes, and the books, and above all, the parchments. Philemon is the smallest of Paul's, one page, about one runaway slave named Onesimus. The name means useful, and Paul spends the letter making a pun out of it. Then 8 more letters, and these are usually named after their authors rather than their destinations, which is the only reason they sit in a separate stack. Hebrews is anonymous. It begins like a sermon and ends like a letter, and its own favorite word is better. Better priest, better promise, better country. James is closer to Proverbs than to Paul. Command after command, almost no argument between them, and a blunt insistence that a faith that does nothing is dead. 1 Peter is written to scattered people. It calls exiles, spread across 5 Roman provinces, and its whole subject is how to suffer without becoming cruel. 2 Peter is about teachers inside the church who are selling something, and much of its middle overlaps, nearly word for word, with the letter of Jude. 1 John has no greeting, no address, and no name attached. It simply begins that which was from the beginning and tests everything against love and truth. 2 John is a single page to a woman he calls the elect lady, warning her which traveling teachers not to house. 3 John is the shortest book in the Bible, and it is a complaint about one man, Diotrephes, who likes to put himself first and will not welcome the people John sends. Jude is a short blast against the same drift, and it does something no other book here does. It quotes a book that is not in this Bible at all. It cites the prophecy of Enoch from a Jewish writing outside the collection, which is a useful reminder that these authors read more widely than our shelf does. And then, last, Revelation. The Greek word is apocalypse, and it does not mean disaster. It means unveiling, a curtain pulled back. It is a letter before it is anything else, addressed to 7 named congregations in Asia Minor with their specific problems listed one by one. And it is the only book in the collection that opens by blessing whoever reads it out loud, which tells you it was written to be heard by a room, not studied alone. It ends the shelf where the shelf began, a garden, a river, a tree. The first pages and the last pages describe the same landscape. That is the whole shelf. Law, history, poetry, prophets, gospels, letters, and one unveiling. And once you know which section you are standing in, no page of it is random anymore. The mildew chapter is a priest's manual. It was never trying to be a story. The boundary lists are a land registry. The genealogies are a memory being rebuilt after a nation almost lost it. The angry letter is angry for a reason you can name. 66 of them, and not one was written to be read alone. Every single one assumes the others are on the shelf beside it. So if you have been starting at page 1 and stalling in the same place every time, try starting at the section instead of the page. Pick the shelf you want. Story, song, sermon, or letter. The book will tell you what it is the moment you stop expecting it to be something else.